Well, first of all, thank you for your kindness to Monsignor last weekend. I had a wonderful vacation, but it's always good to come home and be back with the people that you love too. So it's good to be home. I'm sure you heard that sometime on Friday, the lone winning ticket for the National Mega Millions Lottery was purchased at a Speedway gas station in Des Plaines, right here in Illinois. The lone ticket, the only ticket. The jackpot at the time was at $1.34 billion, not million, billion dollars, and growing. Now, of course, when the number gets that high, all sorts of folks rush out to pick up tickets for their chance to win. You know, it doesn't matter that we actually have greater odds of being hit by lightning or eaten by a shark, right, than having the winning ticket. We think, well, someone has to win, why not me, right? But we can't resist asking ourselves, especially when the economy is so tough right now, well, what would I do with all that money? What would I do with all that money? Now, of course, I know that if Deacon Greg had the winning ticket, he would give it all to St. Gall, right? Of course, yes, of course. What would I do with all that money? But you know, Jesus asked an entirely different question in our gospel today. To whom will all these things you prepared go? To whom will all this piled up wealth of yours go? Now, when Jesus told his audience this parable about the rich farmer, they would have been making certain assumptions about the man in the story. For instance, they would have assumed that he was living a good and moral life. And it was for that reason that God rewarded him with all this excess grain and more money than he knew what to do with. Just as in those days they always assumed that if someone was sick, or if they lived in poverty, or if they didn't have any children, well, then they must be living a sinful life because God was punishing them in those ways. But of course, Jesus rejects that way of thinking right out of hand. That's not how it works with our Lord. Instead, he shows us that greed, which is an excessive attachment to wealth or to material things, he shows us that greed is in fact a substitute for worshiping God. It's idolatry. It's idolatry. So St. Paul says to the Colossians today, put to death anything in your nature that is rooted in earth, like greed, which is idolatry. So piling up all kinds of earthly treasures, if we're doing it simply for ourselves and for our own selfish motives and gratification, doing that while ignoring the treasures of heaven is in fact idolatry. You know, it was written many, many, many years ago that the homes we'll occupy in heaven are constructed out of the material that we send up from our time here on earth. Or as Jesus himself says to us, don't grow rich for yourself. Instead, grow rich in the sight of God. Store up treasure for yourself in heaven. Well, how exactly do we do that? How do we do that? How do we make ourselves, quote unquote, rich in the sight of God? How do we send up the right building materials for our heavenly home? Well, in order to answer that question, I like to go to one of my favorite saints, St. John Chrysostom, who says that we first have to ask ourselves some other questions, namely this. He writes, what do I truly possess? Do I possess the house that I live in or the clothes on my back? How about my very body or my mind? No, St. John says. All of those things have been lent to me for a time by God and will go when I die. So do I possess anything at all? Yes, St. John says. I possess the virtues which during my life have grown and flourished within my soul. I possess the virtues which during my life have grown and flourished within my soul. He goes on. Inasmuch as I have grown in love, I possess love. Inasmuch as I have grown in faith, I possess faith. Inasmuch as I have grown in purity of heart, or mercy, or compassion, or forgiveness, I possess those too. So St. John Chrysostom is saying that all of those things, all of those virtues, well, those are the divine building blocks, as it were, of heaven. Those are the things that are not taken away from us when we leave this earth. Because God, of course, wants heaven to be filled with beautiful virtue. So back to our original question then. How do we store up treasure in heaven? How do we do that? Well, the gospel today makes this very simple suggestion. Put your trust in God. Put your trust in God. And that means that we don't try and find our ultimate security anywhere else, because we know that nothing and no one else can save us ultimately. You know, the rich man in the parable, for instance, he felt secure in his wealth. He was putting his trust there in his wealth, not in God. So we heard him trying to reassure himself. He's talking to himself saying, well, you have blessings in reserve for years to come, so relax. Eat heartily, drink well, enjoy yourself, be merry. But of course, none of those things can save him, right? None of those things can save him. Ultimately, they don't offer the real kind of security that we're looking for. And we can use that same analogy for ourselves, too. We all can ask similar questions. We can say, well, what are the quote-unquote barns that I'm building? What is it that I'm harvesting? What are the things that I'm storing up to try and ensure my security? For some of us, it could be relationships, our marriage, our family and children, our friends. Maybe our security is money itself, the amount we have in savings and pension funds and investments, stock portfolios, wads of cash in the mattress for that matter. Or maybe our security is our status or our position, be it at work or in the community or among our circle of friends. Maybe we're seeking our security in our knowledge or our expertise or our looks or our physique or any number of other things. Now, none of those things, of course, are wrong in and of themselves. Planning financially for our retirement, having a good marriage and healthy friendships, being successful at work, being respected by others, being physically fit, and on and on. All those things are good, Those things only become obstacles when we think that our security lies in them. That is, when we live our lives as if those are the only things that really matter. Then we're in trouble, right? If we live our life that way. Because again, as Jesus says, to whom will all these things go when you're no longer here? So when those things make us self-obsessed or selfish or just focused on ourselves, then they're threatening the integrity of that heavenly home that we're hoping to build. So, if people were given a guided tour to see how our heavenly home was progressing, what would they find? What would they see? Is it a palace or a hut? How far has the work progressed? Is it well underway, or are they just maybe now finally getting to the foundations? What would people be able to tell about us, about our values and our priorities, based on our heavenly home? That is, what are the materials that we're actually sending up to heaven? The virtues that we're working on, the people to whom we're showing love and compassion, the charities that we support. You know, are we committed to anything beyond ourselves? Or is the focus of my life strictly on me? Will our treasures, our earthly treasures, the projects and commitments and sacrifices of our life, will they have served us at all on that day when God calls us to make an accounting of our life and of our soul?